Back in the year 1990, long before he'd developed a reputation or his own business empire, Bobby Kotick wanted to buy a company called Mediagenic. They were in tremendous debt and hadn't turned a profit in years, but Bobby was undeterred. Mediagenic wasn't the most appealing prospect, but he saw something that others didn't. They weren't just a failing software company, they were a failing software company that used to be one of the biggest names in gaming. He didn't really want Mediagenic. He wanted Activision. He wanted their name, he wanted their franchises, and he wanted to bring it all into the modern era. So, how did it all work out? When giving a speech at a 2010 video game conference, Bobby Kotick stated, "To be honest, I don't want to own Mediagenic. I don't want to contract Mediagenic. It might be contagious. I want to own Activision." After the North American video game market crashed in 1983, Activision did their best to continue on, but had difficulty adapting to an ever-changing landscape. While they would still release their own titles, they attempted to generate more revenue by licensing out some of their better-known games. This would allow Japanese developer Sega to create a unique entry in the Pitfall series, the 1985 arcade title Pitfall 2: The Lost Caverns. Sega would also go on to release a port to the SG-1000, the Japanese home console roughly equivalent to the Atari 2600. Both versions adapted the first two entries in the series into one title and were met with critical acclaim upon release. While the arcade game was well received in Sega's home country, it would barely register with consumers during its short run in the States. The SG-1000 only saw limited release outside of Japan, leaving the home port stuck overseas. Activision would also begin publishing the work of others, such as the Micronix-developed Super Pitfall released in 1986. The Nintendo Entertainment System title would not see the same reception as Sega's arcade hit, facing scathing reviews upon release and killing the franchise on Nintendo's increasingly popular console. For a variety of reasons, the original founders of the company would all be gone shortly thereafter, with the company they left behind simply trying to survive at a time when making video games was considered a liability. In the late 80s, the company name was changed to Mediagenic, and they made a pivot to creating different kinds of software in an effort to keep the business alive. Unfortunately, it did not work. Racked with losses and massive debt, the company was eventually purchased in 1991 by Bobby Kotick. Kotick saw the potential for success in the video game industry and felt like the purchase could help boost him into profits and prominence, just not as Mediagenic. The company reverted back to the Activision name in 1992, but only after Bobby had moved the operation to Los Angeles and fired nearly the entire staff. From there, he began work on getting the company out of bankruptcy and started going through their back catalog of game franchises to find something to resurrect. Just as Sega and Micronix had before him, Bobby saw potential in David Crane's original 1982 jungle-themed adventure. Pitfall was one of the company's biggest early hits, a game that helped revolutionize the platforming genre and had the type of name recognition Bobby was looking for to really bring Activision back. While there wasn't much story or character to speak of in the original, a sequel starring the protagonist's son was greenlit and eventually released in 1994. Initially, Pitfall was part of a larger revival, which included sequels to Kaboom and River Raid, but it was ultimately the only game of the three to hit the market. Kotick wanted the title to feel state-of-the-art upon release and commissioned Kroyer Films to handle animation for the game. Kroyer Films, best known for their 1992 animated feature Fern Gully, was founded by former Disney animator Bill Kroyer and his wife Susan. In a 2019 interview, Bill Kroyer stated, "Bobby Kotick, who was chairman at the time, he wanted to do something really different. He wanted the highest quality 2D animation you could get for this new game, and he looked all around town and finally decided we were the ones, because we were the one studio that had Disney quality animation outside of Disney." Kotick and his business partner, Howard Marks, were interested enough in hiring the studio that they even met with Bill and Susan at their house to discuss the project over dinner. Once their work was complete, Bill was also brought out to a computer electronics show to talk about their work alongside Bobby Kotick. Coming out 12 years and 2 console generations after the original, Pitfall: The Mayan Adventure was a massive upgrade in terms of graphics and complexity. The focus is now on completing varied platforming challenges across several levels, rather than exploring the map and finding tucked-away treasures. Boss fights are thrown in the mix as well, with the protagonist now able to hit enemies and use various items in combat. Players will still be swinging on vines and climbing on top of angry crocodiles, but the game feels less like a sequel and more like a modern reimagining. Upon release, contemporary media gave the game solid reviews, and it ended up selling over 1 million copies. Successful games like Mayan Adventure helped give Kotick's version of Activision credibility and momentum to expand and produce even more output. By 1996, the company had over 300 employees and several games in production. The industry was beginning to enter the early 3D era, and Kotick was willing to go all in on the new technology. After the company's success with PC title MechWarrior 2, Activision began to look back at the console market for more opportunities. Systems like the original PlayStation were selling extremely well, and Kotick didn't want to miss out on a brand new and ever-expanding user base. A slate of several games began production, one of which happened to be Pitfall 3D: Beyond the Jungle. Unfortunately, the development of the game ended up being a much bigger task than the team working on it had anticipated. Creating a game in the early years of 3D led to several challenges many of the developers had never encountered before. In an interview published in 2022, designer Aaron Camerata stated, "The addition of 3D, that changed everything for the series. That was when 3D gaming was really born. Even the games that used 3D at the time, like Virtua Fighter or even Battlezone back in the day, used what was basically a 2D game with 3D assets. Giving the player the ability to move around in all 3 dimensions, at least in the platforming genre, required all kinds of solutions to problems that had never existed before." Things like camera placement and multi-directional movement were concepts that game designers had to not only figure out, but also communicate to players in a fashion they would understand. The team faced constant turnover, and development restarted several times while they grappled with designing games in a new dimension. The process would take nearly 3 years before the game finally released, and it ultimately wouldn't find the same success as its predecessors. Coming out in a crowded market, it ended up selling a little over 300,000 units. It wasn't a failure, but it didn't meet the company's expectations or the benchmarks set by earlier entries in the franchise. Launching in early 1998, the game was met with mixed reviews. Some media outlets at the time enjoyed the game's update of the Pitfall formula, while others struggled with the camera and dated design choices. The extended development period led to a lot of games at the time passing it by. Despite this, the game offers quite a bit of variety as the developers explored several different options for their level layouts. Some would feature a lower camera with a more hallway-like design, while others would have long stretches of side-scrolling 2D movement. There are overhead levels built around choice and exploration, and arenas filled with gigantic bosses to battle. It doesn't always succeed at what it's trying, but the game is a fascinating look at one of the many different attempts at nailing down what 3D gaming could be. Hallmarks of the series like vines, traps, and hateful scorpions are there to tie the game into the rest of the series, but things like story and scope were greatly expanded. Comic book-styled storyboards are displayed between levels, and the game's version of Pitfall Harry Jr. is voiced by actor Bruce Campbell. Like with many of his roles, Campbell brings energy and enthusiasm to his voice work and offers humorous quips and commentary throughout the entire game. His inclusion was likely part of a push to incorporate traditional actors into Activision games in an attempt to provide more mass appeal. Also included in this push was Apocalypse, a run-and-gun shooter which starred a digitally scanned Bruce Willis. Apocalypse, much like Pitfall, also faced an extended and difficult development. When both games released and underperformed, it would end up changing how Activision handled game development. Aaron Camerata reflected on this period in the same 2022 interview. After Pitfall took 3 years to ship, and Apocalypse was still struggling with no end in sight, Activision made the decision to shut down internal console development and use only external developers. So after all that work, basically everyone either had to find a job somewhere else on one of the PC games, or was getting laid off. Rather than build off of the collective experience gained through these hard development cycles, Kotick and the rest of the leadership at Activision instead decided to, once again, fire almost everyone and start over. Activision were no strangers to contracting out or licensing their game franchises. Coming out alongside Pitfall 3D was Pitfall Beyond the Jungle on Game Boy Color. Despite sharing similar box art and the same title as the PlayStation game, this release is a wildly different experience published by Crave Entertainment. Marquee titles would sometimes get smaller scale companion releases, but they were generally underfunded with shorter development cycles to ensure they came out around the same time as their console counterparts. This is reflected in the play experience, with stiff controls and unforgiving platforming leading to a generally unpleasant game. Unfortunately, consumers at the time wouldn't have much of an idea how it played without purchasing it. Companion titles would be advertised with their higher budget counterparts, but they tended to not get the same level of coverage or reviews. Their release was about having something on the shelf with name recognition over a desire to make a great gaming experience. Crave Entertainment had released several hit games and would go on to release several more, but giving a developer a strict timeline and little support will lead almost anyone to struggle. Activision wouldn't license out all of their multi-platform releases, but it was easy to tell when a title wasn't a high priority. For the next few years, almost all of Activision's releases were made by outside development groups. They had several frequent collaborators, some of which the company would ultimately purchase and bring in-house. Development for the troubled title Apocalypse was handed off to the studio Neversoft, who were able to ship the game in late 1998. The team would then go on to release the first Tony Hawk's Pro Skater for Activision in late 1999, before being purchased by the company that same year. After Neversoft was acquired, they were put to work on an almost endless amount of entries in the Tony Hawk series. The games were primarily made for the PlayStation platform, but rival system Nintendo 64 would also get ports of the games from other development teams. The first 3 games in the franchise were brought over to the 64 by the team at Edge of Reality, who would also bring Activision and Neversoft's Spider-Man to the platform. Edge of Reality was never purchased by Activision, but the two had developed a strong enough working relationship that the team was able to successfully pitch a new entry in the Pitfalls series. Years removed from Beyond the Jungle, developers had become much more comfortable creating games in 3D. 2004's Pitfall: The Lost Expedition saw players traversing dense jungles, ice-covered mountains, and native villages in a game that allowed for exploration and backtracking across all the game's many locations. During a question and answer session in 2023, creative director and lead designer Richard Hamm talked about inspirations for the game. My favorite sort of game had really been incredibly common in the 8-bit era, the original Nintendo Entertainment System. And those were, I think, what are nowadays referred to as Metroidvania games. Big, sprawling action-adventure games where you've got a continuous world and you explore and you find dead ends, but then later on you find some kind of item, or you level up, or get special powers, or whatever it might be that works as keys to let you get past those dead ends you had previously found. The original pitch for the game had a darker edge and a more realistic tone, but the game made a pivot into a more cartoony style at the request of Activision. Bobby Kotick was apparently becoming more disconnected from development by then, to the point that Robert couldn't even remember his name years later. In a 2019 podcast, he reflected on the original pitch and the direction the game ultimately took. We wanted to have kind of like a more gritty, hardcore, real Pitfall Harry, but still running around dealing with giant scorpions and swinging through jungles and all that. That's what we originally pitched. And I do not remember who the president of Activision was at the time. I want to say Bobby Kotick. I don't know. Anyway, he did not want to do that, because apparently the previous Pitfall, which wasn't very cartoony, had underperformed, and so Activision felt they wanted to have their Mario killer. They wanted to have their mascot character, and so they thought Pitfall Harry was it, so give us a cute, cartoony one for families and kids. Released alongside Pitfall: The Lost Expedition would be a similarly named Game Boy Advance title. It had the same problem the previous generation's Game Boy Color release experienced, with a lack of real advertising or media coverage, but it managed to avoid the extreme disparity in quality that the former game had with its console counterpart. Developed by Taurus Games, rather than feeling like a watered-down version of Lost Expedition, it played like a different interpretation of the same concept. The game is broken up into levels and stages, with varied styles of gameplay and several items being used in unique ways compared to the 3D release. The characters feature smooth animation and movement, several homages to past games, and a decent length for a handheld title. Both releases would end up reviewing well at the time, and Pitfall as a series felt like it was on the upswing, but it ultimately wouldn't matter. These two titles would be the last fully unique and major releases for the franchise under the Kotick regime. Likely as a result of using so many external developers to fill their portfolio, the days of courting studios over a home-cooked meal and attending trade shows to personally show off Activision revivals were seemingly over. The company was growing exponentially by the time Lost Expedition released in 2004, but their desire to reflect on their past was beginning to fade. Released around the same time as Lost Expedition was Tony Hawk's Underground 2, the sixth entry in the series to release in as many years. By that point, consumers were already experiencing fatigue with the skateboarding franchise, but Activision would go on to release several more before shuffling Neversoft over to the Guitar Hero series. After the Tony Hawk games had been thoroughly bled dry, Activision would go on to do the same with Guitar Hero. The franchise would see 16 console and handheld releases over the next 6 years, oversaturating the market to an almost comical degree. Once customers began to turn on that series as well, the company would fall back on a frequently used business plan. They would learn nothing and fire everyone. Neversoft was eventually turned into a support studio before being shuttered, not for lack of quality, but as a result of making the games they were told to make at a pace that would never be sustainable. Activision didn't seem interested in legacy or depth in their release schedule. They were only looking for the one franchise they could release every year to keep the money flowing indefinitely. Of course, there was another notable title released the same year as Lost Expedition. Call of Duty: Finest Hour would come out in 2004, serving as the franchise's debut on consoles. Activision would soon realize they'd found exactly what they'd been looking for. They would continue to release licensed games and entries in other franchises, but all roads would ultimately lead to Call of Duty. By 2008, the series was growing its audience with each title, and Activision was putting more of its purchased studios to work on sequels. Eventually, they'd stop working as frequently with external developers and would have every studio they owned working solely on Call of Duty. But they weren't quite there yet. Released the same year as the Call of Duty entry World at War, the Nintendo Wii would receive Pitfall: The Big Adventure. The title implies something brand new for gamers to experience, but in reality the game is just a port of the Lost Expedition. It would be faced with middling reviews, mostly focused on the poor use of motion controls that plagued several Wii titles at the time, but fortunately, plugging a GameCube controller into the Wii removes all of that and allows for standard play. As a result, it then became a bit of a deluxe version of the previous generation title. Outside of a vaguely related mobile release, Kotick never saw fit to greenlight another entry in the series during his tenure. With every console game released in the franchise, the original Pitfall was included. Every step of the way, players were able to see how far the series had come. Bobby Kotick started off wanting to bring Activision back by celebrating their history and regaining their prominence. He looked to one of their most notable franchises as part of his plan, and in a way, the series helped put the company on the path to success they're on now. When the last entry was being developed, Bobby Kotick was looking for his own Mario. He just didn't seem to understand he already had it. There were years in between entries, and several different creative minds were involved in each game's development. Even with so many shared elements, no two titles really felt the same. Creativity and innovation were able to grow in a way a series relegated to yearly releases simply cannot allow. Failure and missed expectations can sometimes be a vital part of growth, something Bobby never seemed to realize. Pitfall took some big swings with each entry, and while they didn't always hit, at least they were never stagnant.
Hi, Mom.